How much in the way of tax avoidance has Brookfield, I guess to some degree, succeeded in taking advantage of? $6.5 billion. $6.5 billion of tax dodging in just 5 years. And here we have a prime minister who said he was coming to stand up and rescue this country at a time of crisis. But when we look at the actions of this prime minister, we see time and again that his words don't match his deeds. Madam Speaker, I rise to speak on the amendment put forward by the member for Leeds-Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes that I have proudly seconded, calling on the CEO of Brookfield, as well as the clerk of the Privy Council and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, to come before the Ethics Committee and answer questions as we undertake our review of the Conflict of Interest Act. Frankly, they have a lot to answer for, in respect of the Prime Minister's multitude of conflicts of interest, which he continues to hide from Canadians, the Prime Minister's use of offshore tax havens while he was chair of Brookfield to avoid paying taxes in Canada. So much for Mr. Captain Canada, Mr. Elbows Up. And a lot to answer for about the completely inadequate so-called ethics screen that has been set up to supposedly keep the Prime Minister from being involved in making decisions in which he has conflicts of interest. Now, let me say that when it comes to the Prime Minister's conflicts of interest, it's official. The Prime Minister is the most conflicted Prime Minister in Canadian history. Never have we had a Prime Minister with so many conflicts of interest, more than 500 conflicts of interest. An ethics screen comprising of 103 conflicts. And I will be splitting my time with the member for Montmorency, Charlevoix. And despite 500 conflicts, despite the vast and unprecedented nature, it merely scratches the surface of what the Prime Minister's potential conflicts of interest are. And that's because we learned from the Prime Minister's ethics disclosure that he is entitled to receive carried interest payments worth tens of millions of dollars in respect of the performance of 3 major clean tech funds that the Prime Minister set up while he was the chair of Brookfield. The Prime Minister set up the Global Transition Fund, $15 billion fund, the second Global Transition Fund, a $10 billion fund, and the Catalytic Transition Fund. The Prime Minister co-led efforts to draw investment into those funds. He picked the companies. He knows what the holdings of those funds are. And why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because the Prime Minister knows the specific public policy decisions that may impact upon the performance of those funds, which in turn directly relates to the Prime Minister's future bonus pay worth potentially tens of millions of dollars. Canadians deserve to know what the holdings of these funds are. They deserve to know what companies the Prime Minister handpicked, and they deserve to know that the Prime Minister is not involved in making decisions that would impact upon these funds, which in turn would determine the amount that the Prime Minister reaps in the way of future bonus pay. Now, the Prime Minister has had an opportunity to come clean and tell us what is in the funds, but the Prime Minister has refused to do so, and as a consequence, we have a Prime Minister who, to put it generously, may be complying with the letter of the Conflict of Interest Act, but he is certainly not complying with the spirit of the Conflict of Interest Act in the face of these many potential hidden conflicts of interest. And, frankly, the Prime Minister has a lot to answer for based upon his activities at Brookfield. I alluded to these free clean energy funds that the Prime Minister set up. Where did he set up the Global Transition Fund? Oh, not in Canada, but Bermuda. And how about the second Global Transition Fund? Not in Canada. The Prime Minister registered it in Bermuda. And the Catalytic Transition Fund, not in Canada. How about the Cayman Islands? All in offshore tax haven jurisdictions. Last week at committee, we learned about the extent of Brookfield's the use of offshore tax havens by Brookfield. In fact, analysis done by the Canadians for Tax Fairness reveals that of Canada's 123 largest corporations, Brookfield is the largest tax dodger. There was the largest tax gap by Brookfield based upon what Brookfield actually paid in taxes versus what Brookfield should have paid had the statutory tax rate been applied because of Brookfield's use of offshore tax havens. Offshore tax havens that the Prime Minister actively used and took advantage of while he was the chair of Brookfield. How much in the way of tax avoidance has Brookfield, I guess to some degree, succeeded in taking advantage of? $6.5 billion. $6.5 billion of tax dodging in just 5 years. And here we have a Prime Minister who said he was coming to stand up and rescue this country at a time of crisis. But when we look at the actions of this Prime Minister, we see time and again that his words don't match his deeds. That's right. He was very happy to set up major funds, some of the world's largest clean energy funds in offshore tax havens. He's very content to hide behind loopholes in the Conflict of Interest Act, to not disclose his hidden conflicts. And, of course, we know he was very happy to move Brookfield out of Canada to New York City months before he ran for the leadership of the Liberal Party. And then there is the so-called ethics screen. It's an ethics screen that is being administered by who? None other than the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, both of whom answer to the Prime Minister. They are arguably in a blatant conflict of interest in overseeing that screen. And not only that, there are no checks and balances to see that the screen is being used as intended to keep the Prime Minister away from making decisions in which he would have a conflict of interest. There is no reporting mechanism for example. We are really left to having to trust the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Privy Council, who, by the way, even if they were doing their very best, which they may be, to shield the Prime Minister from these types of decisions, are subject to an ambiguous proportionality standard that raises other questions about the effectiveness of the ethics screen. So, for all of these reasons, this amendment couldn't be more timely. We need to hear from the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the Clerk on the ethics screen, and we need to hear from the CEO of Brookfield about the many serious ethical questions surrounding the Prime.
And we must go to questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. As I've indicated, it really is amazing in terms of how the Conservatives have reversed their whole thinking on the issue. Prime Minister Stephen Harper put into place the rules. The current Prime Minister is following the rules. On the blind trust issue, one of the biggest defenders of the blind trust was actually no other than the Conservative current leader of their party. And if you want to talk about a Chief of Staff, think of Nigel Wright. And Nigel Wright coming in from the private sector and the wealth that he has, and being the Chief of Staff for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And at the time, who was defending him? The current leader of the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker. You know, the hypocrisy just oozes out, all as a direct result of the Conservative Party wanting to attack the character of the Prime Minister. I find that disgraceful.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Sturgeon River.
Madam Speaker, I would pose the question to the member, what good is a blind trust in the face of carried interest payments, future bonus pay, in the amount of tens of millions of dollars that the Prime Minister could be entitled to? A blind trust does nothing to deal with that. It does nothing to deal with that. So it is one example of many of the loopholes that exist and the complete inadequacy of a Prime Minister simply saying, well, I've set up a blind trust. Oh, and by the way, I also have an ethics screen that is being administered by my Chief of Staff who answers to me. It's not good enough.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I congratulate and thank my colleague for his speech. Now, the colleague talked about Brookfield subsidiaries in tax havens. There are 5 which are active in Canada, which had access to wage subsidies during the pandemic while not paying tax in Canada because they were registered in tax havens. That is unacceptable. Here's my question. When the Prime Minister makes a decision which will make him personally wealthier, for example, scrapping the web giant's digital tax, saying that that will enable us to get a deal with the American government by July 20th, which of course did not occur. So question, what can be done so that Canadians are not asking themselves, did the Prime Minister do this to make himself personally wealthier or not? And also, in the blind trust, there are Google, Apple, Facebook, that type of company.
Fundamentally lacking is any level of transparency on the part of the Prime Minister. We have a Prime Minister who hasn't revealed all of his conflicts. That's a problem because Canadians cannot therefore be assured that he is in fact avoiding conflicts of interest. And secondly, we have an ethics screen that is based entirely on trust. No reporting, no understanding of when it is being triggered, if it is being triggered. So at the very least, as a starting point, we need transparency from the Prime Minister. Some of the transparency doesn't require amendments to the Act. It just requires the Prime Minister to step forward and to come clean.
Honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Akia Wenrak.
Akia Wendat.
Akia Wenrat.
Akia Wendat.
Merci.
Bon,
Ça s'en vient.
All right, we're getting there. Don't lose faith.
Colleague for his comment, and like me, has been elected 10 years ago, and I want to congratulate it for the fourth mandate in a row. As a very parliamentarian, veteran parliamentarian, you have seen many cases of malversation from this Liberal Party. And we remember Judy Winston-Raybould when the Prime Minister put his two hands in the justice system. That was kind of corruption. Do you think that what we are seeing right now with this actual Prime Minister is exactly at the same level?
for St. Albert, Sturgeon River.
We are seeing, I guess, the more things change, the more things they stay the same. That's what I would say. We had a prime minister who had serious issues around complying with the Conflict of Interest Act, and we have a new prime minister, the current prime minister, who has an unprecedented number of conflicts of interest and is not acting in accordance with, at the very least, the spirit of the Act, and may in fact not be fully complying with the Act. We don't know because of the lack of transparency surrounding the Prime Minister's dealings.
Prise du débat, l'honorable député de